Hi, welcome back to the workshop for episode 10 of Great Guitar Build Off 2023, and in this episode we're going to start work on the fretboard. And the reason I'm going to start work on the fretboard before I do the other bits that I mentioned last week, like fitting the tremolo system, is because a lot of those other bits are dependent upon where we position our nut, and of course our fretboard starts at our nut. Now I could work it all out on measurements, but if I mess that one measurement up, it throws the entire guitar out. So much better is that we have this in position and we can work things out from there. It's also an advantage because with the fretboard in position, we can also double check things by measuring from the 12th fret as well as the nut. So it gives us a little bit of redundant measurement there. Now, as I mentioned in the first episode, the fretboard is going to be made out of this piece of wenge. I've used this wood before for fretboards and it's very nice. It's got quite an open grain, it's quite textured, but it's got these very subtle kind of lines in there which look absolutely beautiful. What's not so great about wenge is it is the most splintery wood you will ever come across, and I'm really kind of trying not to handle this too much because you just get covered in tiny black splinters from it. But once it's machined down and once it's all sanded and everything, it's absolutely fine. Now, this is big enough for our fretboard, easily. We've got plenty of material there. It's a little bit on the wide side, but I don't mind that too much. And what I have in mind for this, which I'll get into later, I don't actually mind a little bit of extra width, but it is far too thick. This is currently about 12mm. It wants to be about 6mm finished, so I need to thin this down significantly. I'm not going to cut it in half. I won't get 2 fretboards out of it, and I also want a little bit of added material because I am going to need to clean it up with a plane to get the finish that I want. So without further ado, we'll get this to the bandsaw and get it trimmed down. Okay, so that's cut straight down the middle. I had to take it out and turn it around and do it from the other side. It was just wandering off at just a touch, so I didn't want to risk messing it up, but we kind of got there in the end. And I set the bandsaw up at 7.5mm. And that's kind of just a touch over 8, so that actually cut quite accurately. And it's consistent to within a few tenths of a mil, so for all intents and purposes that is good enough for what we need. However, it is still a little bit thin, so we need to take maybe a couple of millimeters off this. So once again, good old-fashioned super glue and masking tape, and I'm just going to use my number 4 plane just to take that couple of mil that we need to off of this. Shouldn't take too long, hopefully. Okay, so that's the fretboard planed down to thickness. That was a bit of a job. You might have heard that as I was planing that, it sounded like the plane was just skating over the surface and not really cutting in. And that's pretty much exactly what it was doing. This stuff is hard and tough as old boots. Really difficult to plane. So that took a little while, gave me a good workout, but we've got it done. Now normally, at this point, I'd be mounting this onto the fret slotting template and getting it into the jig and getting the fret slots cut. But I'm going to go about this fretboard in a slightly different manner. So the first thing I'm going to do is mark it up for its center line, and then we're actually going to mark it to the shape that we want in terms of the taper on the fretboard, get it to the bandsaw and get it cut down. Okay, so what I've done there is I've cut center marks into each end of this fretboard so that as I work through this I can go back and reinstate my center lines whenever I need from those like really positive cuts that will always be there until we do the final trimming. I then position my fretboard template on where I want it, and then I've brought those marks in around about 1 millimeter or so and mark my lines there. And my plan is I'm going to cut these pieces off the outside, which will leave the fretboard slightly undersized. I'll clean up that edge with a plane so it's nice and straight and smooth. We will then put our fret slots in, radius the board, re-establish those fret slots as we need them to their full proper depth, and then I'm going to trim these sections down a little bit and re-glue them to the side. From there they can then be cleaned up to whatever thickness we need them, and effectively we'll have matching binding to the fretboard. And if I do this correctly, I should be able to pick up the grain pattern as well, so it will look like nothing's ever happened and you won't be able to see the fret slots on the edge of the board. It's quite complicated. It's a little bit more complicated than I usually do, but I'm hoping it will give me a nice result. So next up, over to the bandsaw and get this trimmed down. Okay, so that's trimmed down. I've marked these two little bits as to which side of the fretboard they come from. So this is the bass side, this is the treble side. So I'm going to put these to one side where they'll be safe. And I'm going to get this back into the vise. And I'm just going to very quickly true up these edges with the number 6 plane. Won't take long. So those are nice and straight now, but I need to make sure that they're kind of the right size. Now I'm thinking if I add 1.5 millimeters to each side of this in the binding wood, that will give me the right size. Of course, if this is slightly under, it doesn't really matter because I can just put more on the outside, but I would like it to be something like. So at the nut, my template is 44 mil, and this isn't that far off it. So that needs to come down a little way. And at the 12th fret, that is 53 mil. If I mark approximately where the 12th fret is going to be and measure that, that's actually over. So I need to take a fair amount of material off this on both sides. So we'll just get that back into the vise and do a little bit more planing. Okay, so that's planed down to the size I want it now, and basically I did 4 strokes one side, turned it over, did 4 strokes the other, checked it for size, rinse and repeat until I've got it kind of pretty much where I want it. There's kind of like less than half a millimeter away. So I'm just going to take that tape off for the time being. And we can get this set up now on our fret ruler. And we are going 24 3/4 inch scale, and we got more than enough material there. So the first thing I'm going to do, run a length of tape along this. I need to find the center of this. I'll just very quickly use a centering rule to do that. We can then super glue and masking tape our fretboard on, lining it up on our center markings, and we're ready to slot. Okay, so there's the slots put in. That was hard work. This stuff is really, really tough. It's very hard to saw into. It was hard to plane. I think it's going to be hard to put the radius in, and it's going to be hard to sand. So I am getting a very good workout in the shed tonight, which is never a bad thing. So next up, we need to get this off this template. I'll try and do that without bending the template too much. And we can get rid of that and the jig for the time being. And we can now think about getting a radius onto this board. However, as with everything so far on this build, it's not quite that straightforward because we need to figure out exactly what the radius is going to be for this Floyd Rose tremolo that we're going to use. And from what I've been able to find out, these things have between a 10 and a 12-inch radius on them. But I've been told that the standard for the nut, at least, is a 10-inch radius. Now I like to go with a 12-inch radius on my fretboards. It's just what I prefer. I'm going to try and see if I can measure these somehow just to find out what they are. If it is a 10, I'm not sure it will make any appreciable difference. So I'll measure them, and if that's what they come out at, I'm happy to go with the 12-inch radius. And I've just checked these with my little radius gauges, and the nut is indeed a 10-inch radius, and the saddles on the tremolo unit are at a 12-inch radius, which is great because that means I can go with my preferred radius on the fretboard. So I'll get rid of those again. And we can get this set up for radiusing. Now, I'm not relishing the idea of sanding this whole radius in because this stuff is, as I've said, tough as old boots. So I am going to once again get this down onto the bench with masking tape and super glue, and I'm going to start working at these outside edges with a plane just to take some material off there, get it as close as I can so I'm not having to do a whole heap of sanding. The problem I'm going to have though is because of the shape I've cut into this, I'm going to be kind of forced to plane at a bit of an angle, and if I'm not careful I'll put a compound radius onto this, which in this instant isn't really what I want. So I just need to make sure I'm not taking too much off this end, and then once we get the sanding block in play, we should be able to get this down exactly how we want it. Well, I've actually surprised myself there because that went really quickly. I think having the taper cut onto the board helps because there's obviously less material to radius. The plane worked really well, just taking those edges off. It worked a lot better in that configuration than it did trying to flatten it out. So I was able to take most of the material off with the plane, which just left a tiny little bit that I had to take off with the block. This is 60 grit on one side and I think it's 180 on the other. So I've got that down to a very, very consistent 12-inch radius now, and it is quite smooth. So that's good. Now, I said earlier that at this stage I was going to glue the other bits of the fretboard back on to create that kind of binding effect. I am going to do that. However, I'm not going to do it at this point because the whole reason for doing that binding that way is because I'm going to put some inlays in this, and with the binding strips cut off, I can actually cut those where needed right the way across the fretboard, because as this guitar is a homage to the 80s shred machines, it wouldn't be complete without some shark fin inlays. However, because we've got the reverse headstock, I'm going to go the whole hog, and we're going to have reverse shark fin inlays as seen in this picture, which I think will look absolutely amazing. And I'm really hoping that this little piece of perloid is enough to get all of the inlays out of. It should be. I think we can easily get 2 widths of fretboard out of the bit I've got, especially when we're working with some of these inlays at the other end. So we should be able to get everything we need out of that little bit. I used this on my Rickenbacker build a few builds ago and it came out very, very nice. So I'm happy to use that again. However, that's all going to be for the next episode. I'll leave this one here, so don't forget to hit that like button if you've enjoyed this. Subscribe if you haven't already done so. I'll be back probably in a few days' time on Saturday with the continuation of the Fire Chick build, so don't forget to tune in for that one. But I'll also be back very soon with this build as well. So as always, thanks a lot for watching. Bye bye.